Today, let's talk about Python APIs with JSON. And we'll look at a few examples with the Open Notify APIs. What are APIs? APIs are application programming interfaces. They are commonly used to retrieve data from servers and sites. For example, you can create a program to interact with APIs offered by Twitter or Facebook and collect data from there using special queries supported by these APIs. With the related APIs, you can offer dynamic changing data, and people from the client side can focus on data of interest from a large data set instead of having to take care of the entire data set, because related computation can be done on the server side instead of the client side. So the client side can focus on the data itself without worrying too much about the computational cost or the logics to analyze it. It takes client-server communication with APIs. In a communication, the client or a program they will create can interact with the server by sending a request to the server side. And once the server receives the request, it can actually process the request, and sometimes it can actually go to its database and analyze the data and provides related data corresponding to that request. So once the data is back and ready, the server can send the data back to the client side, and the client side can collect the data and process it in the way that it needs. Now today, lots of APIs are on the web, and they communicate using the HTTP or HTTPS protocols, because the web is based on this HTTP or hypertext transfer protocols. And APIs are hosted on web servers. They are essentially just like web pages, but of course they are formatted in a specific structure so that you know how to process them. And you can use a browser or related tools to test these APIs. Today, JSON or JavaScript object notation is a common data format when you interact with these web APIs. We can use Python to create programs to interact with these web APIs. One particular library that we can use is the request library for HTTP communications. And we can follow the HTTP protocol to send requests such as get, post, or delete to do different type of operations. One common method, of course, is simply to retrieve data, so you may want to simply send a get request with related parameters to retrieve the data that you need. So the request can be sent to an endpoint, which is essentially a server route used to retrieve data from the API. Let's look at an example web API at Open Notify. So at this particular opennotify.org, you can send a GET request to retrieve information about the International Space Station. There are multiple other endpoints there for different types of data, but let's first take a look at this particular endpoint, issnow.json. This particular endpoint offers information about the current latitude and longitude of the International Space Station. We can import the requests library, and then by using the .get method, we send a GET request to this specific endpoint here, and we know this endpoint is about the information and the latest position of the ISS. So once we send a request and the server process our request, it's going to send a piece of information back to us. and we can assign this piece of information to something called response. And so response captures everything from the server, and we can take a look at what it is. And so part of the response object is this status code, which tells us about the status of the data processing on the server side. Here we get a code of 200, which means everything is okay. Now there are different codes that you may receive when you interact with the server API. For example, 301 indicates the server is redirecting you to a different endpoint. 401 means the page you try to access is not authenticated. 400 means you are sending a bad request, that the endpoint is correct, but you probably do not provide the correct parameters. 403 indicates the access is forbidden, and 404 means the resource is not found on the server. So let's take a look at a couple of examples about different status codes. We are sending a request to this ISS path, which does not exist, and you are going to receive a code of 404, which is something you often encounter when you enter a link that is broken, or you type in a link that is not correct. When you try this in the browser, you're going to get the same error code 404, indicating that this is not an existing page. Let's do another try. Now we correct the URL. So we are sending this request to isspath.json. And this entire URL we know is correct. So the endpoint is correct. But when we send this request to the server and get a response back, and we print the status code, it says 400, which indicates that this hits an available endpoint, but it's a bad request. Most likely, we have provided incorrect parameters. For our Python code to work with APIs properly, we need to connect to an available endpoint. So we have to have the correct URL. And then we need to provide the required parameters in the request. Otherwise, it's a bad request, even if you hit the correct address. And third, we may need to provide proper authentication if necessary. We'll look at a couple more examples of the Open Notify API. For this isspath.json API, it returns the time when the ISS will pass over a given location on Earth. And it requires two parameters about the location that you are interested in: the latitude of the location and the longitude of the location. We know the correct parameters for this particular endpoint. We should provide the correct endpoint with the required parameters here. So we need to provide the parameters. So because we know this is a JSON communication, we can provide the parameters in the JSON format. And so as you remember, a pair of curly braces indicate a JSON object. And inside the object, you can have pairs of key value pairs. So we provide the parameters in the key and value pairs. So latitude and longitude. Okay, and this is actually the location of New York City. Okay, so now we have the parameters ready. We can send a GET request to this ISS path JSON endpoint. And the second argument in the GET method is to provide the parameters. Okay, so we send the request with the parameters and get the response back. Now we can see what is inside the response. And so from here, we can tell that we have received some message from the server. The output data here, however, look messy. It's kind of difficult to read. Let's check a few things in the response. So first, let's check the header of the response. So if you use .headers, it's going to pull out the metadata about the response. The server that is providing the data, the datetime information, the content type, the length, and so forth. We can particularly focus on this content type here. We can use headers and then a pair of square brackets and then content type, the key for this piece of information. We can get this piece of information out, which says application/JSON. So this means that the server provides data in the JSON format. So now we know the format from the server side. We can actually use related tools in Python to parse the data so that we can provide and process the data in the proper format. With JSON, we know we can use the JSON module in Python. One way is that we can continue to use this response.content to get the raw data from the server. And then we can use JSON.loads method to load the data into a JSON object. Okay, so the data here will become a JSON object for the server response, and then we can output this data. So now we know that this piece of data has been parsed into the JSON format. So this is one approach of getting the data in the proper JSON format. The other is that because JSON is so common for web communications today, it has already been built in as part of the HTTP communication. So you can actually use the response.json method to get the data already processed in the JSON format. Okay, so the second method will actually give you the same thing. Okay, it's a piece of JSON object. Now in this JSON data, you can see there are a few specific elements in the data, such as message, request, response. And so, for example, if you are interested in the message, you can use the key message to get the value corresponding to this key. Data is a variable holding the JSON data from server. And with the key message, we can actually get what is inside that message.